Hey, it's Jim, and this is level 3 of the CFA program, the topic on portfolio management and wealth planning, and the reading on portfolio management for institutional investors. You probably know that this reading is 80-some pages long, so like we regularly do, we have divided this into two parts. Part 1, we'll just cover these first 3 LOSs. And I want to make a comment about potential exam questions here before we get into the body of the slide deck. Great exam questions, and these show up at the end of this reading, some commonalities and some differences. So we have a handful, of different institutions, and if you can remember the commons, and then you can remember the differences a little bit easier. And then, of course, we're going to focus on the investment policy statement, which includes things like liquidity needs and time horizons and risk and return objectives and different kinds of stakeholders. Then in part 2, we'll go ahead and finish up those last handful of LOSs. The beginning of this reading is kind of like a history lesson. Introduces these 4 types of institutional investors. And what I would like for you to do is to make this personal. As you're going through this slide deck and as you're studying, pick an institution that you know, like your own pension plan. If you don't have a pension plan, then just pick one out there. Just go to the Wall Street Journal and type in, the State of Arkansas pension plan or whatever it is. Sovereign wealth funds. Those of you who are golfers, this is a huge addition to our understanding with the PGA Tour and Live Golf and, the whole sovereign wealth fund that's behind that. So just imagine that as you work through these examples. University endowments, of course, you guys all went to college. So just wherever you went to college, just type in, what is my college's endowment fund? And then private foundations, some of you might not know about these that have a particular relationship, but this is easy to find. Just do a quick search for wherever you are in your local area, and just type in a private foundation, in Chicago, and you'll find one. Make that yours, and then we all deal with banks and insurance companies. So if you make it personal, then you'll be able to jog your memory about things that you've been through during the course of your just regular lifetime, and that will lend you with a better probability of answering those questions correctly on the exam. So here's the history lesson that I was referring to in the beginning of this reading. There's some numbers. I can't imagine that the Institute would ask you for $35 trillion in pensions, but this one's important here. Pension plans, liability-driven investment. We'll talk about this as we go through the slide deck. But the pension plan model is kind of creeping over into other kinds of institutional investors. And all this really is to make certain that you're aware of what goes on the right-hand side of the balance sheet and on the left-hand side of the balance sheet, and to be aware that those things are related to each other. Now, of course, they don't have correlation coefficients of exactly 1, but, it would be nice if they did. And that's why we do all that duration matching, and we talk about convexity and interest rate risk. We try to do all that stuff. $7 trillion for sovereign wealth funds. So, of course, the word sovereign means government. So these are government-owned investment funds. Recent decades, they've accumulated their wealth. Innovative investment strategies. All right, here we go. Think of the Saudi sovereign wealth fund had invested in soccer, and it's now invested in professional golf. So what does that sound like? It sounds like an awful lot like active management. I mean, I don't think you or I, and no offense to your personal wealth, could go out and buy shares of stock in the PGA Tour, because those things don't exist. And even if they did, we might not be able to afford it. Here's some information on endowment funds. I'm guessing if you read the Wall Street Journal regularly, you'll know about Harvard. They have this massive endowment fund. And then banks and insurers. There's $9 trillion. Now, this is where we've had these great conversations about this, liability-driven investments. We need to make certain, especially with banks and insurance companies, that what goes on the right-hand side of the balance sheet for the banks and insurance companies, which are things like deposits, and then what goes on the left-hand side, which are things, like loans for financial institutions. It's very similar for insurance companies. But they have, look at that bottom one there, complex and evolving, all sorts of different kinds of things. Here's a shift. I can't imagine that the Institute would ask this question, but I think it's important to understand history. You guys that watch my recordings know that I love giving history lessons. And so you think about how this the institutional investor attitude toward the investment policy statement has changed, pretty much since the advent of the CFA designation. And so notice as we go through each kinds of these different decades, we get a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more sophisticated, and a little bit more sophisticated. So who knows what happens when we get into the 2030s and the 2040s. I won't be around for that, so you guys can figure that out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this first LOS. What was I saying earlier about the commonalities here? So what we'll do is go through these in fairly good detail. In fact, one of the very first sentences in this section suggests something like these institutions can be pretty small, like less than 25 million, or they can be pretty large. And I forget the number in there, 5 billion or 1 billion, whatever it is. So that's probably important. As part of the question stem, I imagine that the Institute would not say, there are, $52 million of assets under management for this particular institution. I imagine it would say, this is a relatively small institution or something like that. Now, the interesting thing here from an examination standpoint is that there are some advantages and disadvantages to being small, and the same way with being large. And so here are a couple of them that we have listed. Smaller institutions probably have some challenges in diversifying their portfolio because of, high minimum investment requirements. Remember that whole conversation we had about hedge funds and private equity. Difficult to hire skilled investment professionals because skilled investment professionals, they might say something like, you only have $8 million. That's a waste of my time. I'm not going to do it. And by the way, I'm really, really smart, and you're really going to, if you ever grow to be 800 million, give me a call, something like that. Now, of course, the large institutions, go back to our microeconomics days, they're going to benefit from economies of scale because they can scan, and then they have access to all these kinds of markets. And then they have the funding to go ahead and hire, super talented external managers. Almost all these institutions have long-term investment horizons. Of course, you have to be a little bit careful with pension funds. You got to match the current employees with the retired employees. So in general, it's long term, but then you got to worry about the liquidity in the short term, and that depends mostly on the funded status. If the pension fund has assets of this much and they have liabilities of this much, then we don't care what we're doing, right? We'll be able to manage that for a super long time. Banks and insurance companies, here, go ahead and think of your bank, or go ahead and think of SV Bank. What did they do? Over on their right-hand side of the balance sheet, they had all these short-term liabilities, and then they took some of that capital, actually it was a large portion of that capital, and they invested in medium to long-term treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities, so interest rates go up. That's bad news. That's bad news on both sides of the balance sheet for those particular accounts. And so, Wall Street Journal journalists and editors were super critical of that asset liability management of SV Bank. So in general, long term, but for pensions and banks and insurance companies, you got to be a little bit sensitive about the right and left-hand side of the balance sheet. Now, there's an interesting, actually, I just made that up. There's a very, very dull section in the reading about regulation. And so it actually lists different countries, and it actually lists different regulatory bodies. I can't imagine that the Institute would ask you all of those, what all of those letters and what all those things mean. just be aware of the goals down there. So common characteristics would be that they're subject to legal, regulatory, tax, accounting frameworks. They're different by those things are different in each jurisdiction. But look down at the bottom. This is probably the exam question. Protect investors, ensure safety of financial institutions, and then maintain integrity. So go back to our professional standards, and that word integrity crops up all the time. And so, of course, it's applied to, these institutions. And then they have, this umbrella up here. And this umbrella, it could be just regulatory bodies, or it could be Congress and the lawmakers who are saying, you know what, unless you do this, we're going to throw you in jail. Although I'm pretty sure unless you steal money from an institution, if you violate some accounting framework, you're probably not going to jail. Let's go back and remind ourselves about this relationship between principals and agents and the intermediaries that go through them. Let me just quickly remind you that for publicly held corporations, you have the shareholders who then vote for the board of directors. And then the board of directors generally have, two objectives or two responsibilities or two functions, to establish the strategic plan or the strategic direction of the company, and then to hire and monitor and compensate and evaluate and then ultimately fire the executive leadership team. Well, that kind of a framework is almost exactly like what the Institute is talking about here in this section, with a couple of different exceptions. And so, you think about the board. What the Institute is saying in this reading is, the board, of course, they're part of the hiring and firing of, we've got these internal and external managers, and so they're probably part of that. But the Institute suggests that leave that up to the investment committee, leave it up to the chief financial officer or the chief investment officer, or maybe the chief risk officer, or maybe the combination of some of those individuals. But what the board should do, the board ought to focus on the policy statement, all the things that we'll talk about here inside of this reading, and then let the hiring and the firing and the evaluation, let that to the chief investment officer. So who's on the board? We've got people from the company, we've got some employees, and we have independent directors. Let me just remind you that if you do a quick search of any company that like Procter & Gamble or Johnson & Johnson, and you look at their board members, they usually have one, maybe two internal board members, and then the rest are independent. So that is super important, and that's going to lend itself to monitoring and managing the principal agent problem that we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. All right, so here we go. Roles of the board. These are probably general questions that might show up on the exam. Establish the policy statement. So that makes perfect sense. And then remember that the risk objective and the return objective of an institution is going to be determined by, in general, two kinds of people. The beneficiaries, of course, but then the attitude of the board members. So define the risk appetite, set investment strategy, which probably includes some kind of a strategic asset allocation. The board is way up here. They probably shouldn't get into the details of maybe some tactical asset allocation. Let's leave that to the chief investment officer and then the internal or external managers. And then, of course, we want to delegate as needed to all these kinds of things, but the delegation is probably left to the chief investment officer better. In fact, in the reading, the Institute uses the term best practices. All right, so we've got this investment committee, subcommittee, internal team of investment staff implements the investment policy statement. Now, I don't do this anymore, but I used to sit on a board, and I was part of the investment committee for a not-for-profit. And one of my responsibilities was, and I was the only one on the investment committee who was a CFA charter holder, and my job was just to kind of review the policy statement. And when the managers would come in and give us their reports, I would say, all right, here's the policy statement. This is what you're doing. Are you sure? And, it was pretty obvious. And we had a great relationship with the managers. But, the interesting thing is that they would always come to us and say, oh, you know what? This is your risk level. If you just expand it a little bit, then I can do this and this and this. And I would always raise my eyebrows and say, you know what? We'll think about it. All right, here's some other commonalities here. This is what we talked about, right? Implemented through the investment office. What we can do is we can in-house with internal managers, or we can have outsourcing depending on our resources. So that green column there, that relates back to size. So worry about this depending on resources and needs. Worry about that with the size of the institution. Yeah, outsourcing is very common for larger ones there. Consultants, of course, we're going to need help, right? Unless we're this massive company and we have experts in-house, we're probably going to need to hire somebody out there. Yeah, look at the orange column out there for banks and insurance companies. So what is this? Primarily manage investing and risk. So balance sheet. This is what I was saying earlier. And of course, the banks and insurance companies, they're probably the most regulated of any of these institutions, although some might argue that pensions can be thrown in there. But they have tremendous amounts of regulation. So the compliance staff, has to be experts, of course, in the law, but then they have to be experts in finance law, and then they have to be experts in being able to convince all of the internal and external managers and the board and everybody that, hey, this is what we need to be doing. Here's the slide on this principal agent problem. Let me just quickly remind you, back in publicly held corporations, what do we have? We have the shareholders voting for the voting for the board of directors, and then they hire the executive leadership team. That executive leadership team is hounded on a daily basis by competing objectives. What's the goal of any individual is to maximize self-interest. There we have that blue box over there. Maximize their own personal wealth. What's the goal of the business? The goal of the business is always to maximize shareholder wealth. So you have these competing goals. So in a publicly held corporation, we have the board of directors to monitor all of this stuff. And it's primarily done through monitoring, but through compensation contracts and agreements and motivating the executive leadership team to make decisions that are consistent with the owners or the shareholders of the business. And so this is exactly true here as it applies to institutional investors, but with one different kind of a subtle change. What we're worried about here is not so much internal money managers, but external managers when there are compensation agreements that are not consistent with probably what shows up on the risk and return objective. In fact, the reading does mention conflicts of interest, and it says something like, hey, let's make sure that, look over in the right-hand side there in that bottom box, high base fee structures that do something that's probably not consistent with what that policy statement. So remember, principal agent issues, think about what we talked about in level 1 and level 2, but then high base fee structure. That'll probably get you lots and lots of points on the exam. All right, what's the solution to that principal agent problem? And the solution is what I tell my students and what I've said to you guys over the years is, hey, when you have a problem, figure it out. So the Institute has a little bit more of a formal model of figuring it out. Strong governance models, high accountability, participation, and in fact, I'll give it my own term, eager participation by the board and the investment committee and any kind of other committees in there, active participation in and taking seriously all of those board responsibilities. And so if you combine these three, then, the problems, they tend to go away. And this goes back to what we talked about in level 2 with, corporate culture. If you have a chief investment officer and a chief risk officer and a chief financial officer, if you have these three individuals who are excellent leaders, who are, you can see my little Adam Smith invisible hand going out there to the camera. That's not really invisible, but sometimes it's invisible. If these three super talented individuals are good leaders, then they'll be able to convince everybody that all this other stuff is super important, and let's be aware of it. All right, common components of the policy statement. We know this from level 1 and level 2, but let's go ahead and talk specifically about risk and return objectives down in that bottom left. Let's go ahead and start with this. I said this a little bit earlier. It depends on a couple of things, the ability and the willingness of the board of directors, and then, the idea behind the creation of the institutional group. If we have a pension fund, what are we doing? We're managing the pension fund so that there's enough capital to pay all of our retired workers. So you got to link the risk tolerance of those beneficiaries with the possibilities of return out there. Now, it could be as simple as the following example. Suppose I'm Jim and I, today I play the Powerball lottery and I win $1 billion. And after I pay taxes and give a bunch of money away to all my family members, I have a couple $100 million left, and I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to start Jim's Foundation. So I create this foundation and think about the extremes. I could say that what I want the investment committee to do is I want them to take $100,000 every day, and I want them to go to Las Vegas and play blackjack for 10 minutes and then bring all the winnings back, whatever it is. All right, so there we go. Or I could say, I want you to take this money and I want you to invest it in Treasury securities, and I don't want you to spend any of it for 25 years for this reason or that reason. So those are two extremes, right? So keep in mind that each institutional investor will have different investment objectives depending on who the beneficiaries are. All right, so that leads right into the constraints affecting asset allocation. I could say, here's all my money, but I want you to invest in Treasury securities, or I want you to go to Las Vegas, right? That's a constraint. Those are two extreme constraints. I can't imagine they would show up on the exam. Although the Treasury restriction is probably a little bit more likely than the let's go to Las Vegas restriction. And then remember what I was saying earlier, that it's probably the board's responsibility to identify the strategic allocation policy, but then let's leave it up to the chief investment officer or the external managers, or combination of some of them, to tactically move away from that during short time periods. We need to know balancing, we need to know implementation and reporting requirements. Reviewed annually, we talked about this before. Revised infrequently. This is what I was saying earlier about my responsibility on the investment committee, that I would think about those requests, and every once in a while we would say, we're okay with that. In fact, our biggest decision was to allow the manager to include a handful of BB rated bonds out there because they were not in investment graded bonds. And, so we did stuff like that. But, these changes are going to occur, kind of gradually, unless, of course, the investor's circumstance change, or we have COVID, or we have a stock market crash, or whatever. And remember, those investor circumstances, those are a function of the beneficiaries. So think about a pension. If you're the pension fund manager and you have no retired workers, and you have all these workers over here who are contributing to this, maybe the firm is contributing, maybe they're contributing. We'll talk about the difference between the two plans here in just a little bit. But you have all this money and you have no liquidity needs. And then all of a sudden the firm says, hey, you know what? We're going to give early retirement to these 29 people, and all 29 take it. So you go from having no liquidity needs to having substantial liquidity needs. So that's what significant changes. So if it's a pension example, look for something like that, a dramatic change in the number of retired versus working employees. This is what I was saying earlier. It's the board's job, what did I say earlier, the strategic plan or the strategic direction, so that organization's mission, which might come from the long time ago, maybe hundreds of years ago. And so we need to continue to establish. Those of you who read the Wall Street Journal, I won't give you any names, that there are lots and lots of these private foundations and some foundations that are established by founding fathers or mothers of a corporation that have kind of strayed from the original mission. Now, let's go ahead and quickly go through banks and insurance and some pension funds that are unique characteristics of the policy statement. Expected return on assets, expected cost of liabilities. So that's that, liability-driven investment. That's the asset management function that's so important for banks and insurance companies. And so look at that fourth block point there. We need to be aware of the economic relationship between assets and liabilities. And so I'm guessing what the Institute will do on an exam question, which is what I would do, is say something like, here are the assets and here are some of the details, and I give you details, expected return according to the capital asset pricing model, 10%, whatever it is. And then over here, there are liabilities, and the liabilities over here, there's a bunch of them due tomorrow, there's a bunch of them due next week, and there's a ton of them due 8.5 months from now. That's the signal that we've got long-term over here and we've got short-term over here. So how do we identify that economic relationship? So what that means is that we need to adjust our investments to match what's going on the right-hand side of the balance sheet. Now, for pensions, what we need to worry about are the relationship between the value of the liabilities and the value of the assets. We call this the funded status. So if we're fully funded, that's super great. But most pension funds, as you know, are not fully funded. They are underfunded. Although there are some that have a surplus. So we talked about this in level 3. We're not talking about it now, but at other parts of level 3, what if you have a surplus? Well, then you can manage the surplus rather than in addition or with different kinds of risk and return objectives. Now, endowments, especially university endowments, maintaining long-term purchasing power. I hear this at my school all the time. Our endowment has expanded and faculty say something like, we made $30 million last year in our fixed income and our equity investments. Why can't the faculty have some of that for, travel or research or salary, whatever it is? And the administration always says, well, what are you going to do when we have a stock market crash and we lose 20 or $30 million? So, that endowment fund clearly, a university endowment fund, clearly the beneficiaries, and we'll see this here in just a minute, are, our current students and future students, and then, administrators and faculty, and the long-term viability of that university is super important. So maintaining long-term purchasing power. Now, lots of times we'll have a return objective. We'll have an actual number that says something like, we have this benchmark over here, and we think that benchmark is going to earn 10%, and we want to earn 12%. So a return over a long term with some kind of acceptable risk. Notice the last circle point there, in line with the organization's risk tolerance and constraints. So that's all the board of directors stuff. Now, I always refer to the end of reading questions, and there are multiple questions that relate to these different kinds of models. So investment approaches. So the Norway model, think of this as passively managed with super low expenses and costs. All we're going to do is say something like, hey, let's do 60% equity, let's do 40% fixed income security. That's part of the Norway model. And then, after some time, we'll go ahead and rebalance, but we're not going to do much active. The endowment model, this, of course, was popularized by the Harvard. We do lots and lots of hedge funds. We do lots and lots of private equity. We do lots and lots of active management. And we hire all those really smart men and women over there to externally manage the assets. So you see there's a huge difference between Norway and the Harvard endowment model. Remember, probably the two key words there, passive and active. The Canadian model is similar to the endowment model in that it has lots and lots of allocation to hedge funds and private equity. However, internally managed assets that are actively managed. So remember the difference between endowment and the Canadian model, active versus and external versus active and internal. And then this is what we've been saying for some time here in this recording, the liability-driven investment model. This is taking a look at the difference between the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the balance sheet. And so notice what word we have in there: long duration fixed income securities. This is a great time to think of SV Bank. Go ahead and get your phones out and take a picture of this one here. There are advantages and disadvantages, and these are all self-explanatory, so you probably have heard me talk about these in level 1 and level 2 and level 3. What I would like you to focus on here as potential exam questions is the relationship between and among each of these models and their risk levels and their return objective. All right, this LOS asks us to look at the different kinds of stakeholders. So I mentioned this just a little bit. So what are pension funds? So let's do a defined benefit plan. So what that means is that the employer sets aside a whole bunch of capital. Maybe the employee has to contribute some. And then you have this big chunk of capital and you have defined the benefit. So you might have a formula that says something like, all right, if your employee's average salary over his or her last 3 years was $100,000 and they've worked for 47 years, well, we'll multiply some things and we'll divide some things and subtract some things, and we'll come up with this equation, this pension equation, and maybe it'll say, hey, you know what, this employee is owed $59,000 a year. And that thing may or may not be subject to inflation. It may or may not be subject to some kind of other adjustment. And so what's the goal here? We need to make sure that we have enough capital to pay, what does it say, that second diamond point? Have sufficient assets to meet future liabilities. So think about, this goes all the way back to the very first thing we did in level 1 with time value of money. You have the pension assets, which are all present values, right? We know that. And you have the pension liabilities, which, with the exception of next week's pay to the retired workers, these are all future values, right? So we need to take the present value of those liabilities. All right, so who are the stakeholders here? So the sponsor, they make the plan contributions. The participants, so these people receive their retirement income. And so what are they worried about? They're worried about the employer going bankrupt, right? Defaulting on their retirement income. Think of Enron. These poor Enron employees, they were getting their compensation in Enron stock. They were putting their retirement into a pension plan that included mostly Enron stock. So when Enron went bankrupt, they lost their life savings, they lost their job, and they lost their pension. Right. Success of the pension depends on the performance of the investment staff and the committee and the board. We said all that. All right. So governments, there are tax savings. Of course, you guys know about all those tax savings. Shareholders of the sponsoring company, they bear the financial risk if the plan is underfunded. So if we have this scenario under which we've got the assets that don't meet the present value of the liabilities, well, then what's going to happen? Well, then the shareholders are going to have to forego positive NPV projects to add to the value of that fund. Potential future employees and taxpayers. Those are other stakeholders. Here's a really, really detailed slide, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I think this is self-explanatory. Feel free to take a picture of it if you want to go over it yourself. But this is really well explained inside of the reading. So factors that influence the right-hand side of that defined benefit plan: service and tenure. This is what I was talking about with that formula. Salary and earnings, this is what I was talking about in that formula. And then mortality, of course, when someone retires, you'd like to know what kind of health they're in. And so you still say to them, hey, you know what, you ought to go to the doctors every year and get a checkup. Yeah, and this is so important. Let me just, as a 61-year-old dude here, just please go to the doctor. If you have a problem, just go to the doctor and say, you know what, maybe I've lost my mind, but can you check this thing out here? I'm really worried about it. This is super important to maintain your health. There's my lifetime advice. Expected investment returns, of course, those are going to depend on what kind of assets that we invest in over on the left-hand side of the balance sheet, among other kinds of things, which include things like the appropriate discount rate. Notice what word that we use down there that's taken right out of the reading, a suitable discount rate. Suitable means, it's got to be risk adjusted. And then this is what I was saying earlier. What was that number? I got 59,000. Maybe next year it's 61,000. Then maybe it's 68,000. Then maybe it's 75,000. So do we need to have these matching contributions? Do we need to have additional contributions? And then, when can the employee start being? When does that employee become our responsibility? Is it the date we hire him or her, or is it 3 years or 5 years or 27 years? And so we've got all these different kinds of rules, and those rules are going to be determined by the board. Here's a quick slide about this funding ratio. So look at the second block point, fair value of the plan assets, which I just said just a moment ago. Those are present values, right? And then the present value of the defined benefit obligation. Some countries may require a funded ratio of 100%. If it's less than 100, then of course it's underfunded. If it's over 100%, then it is overfunded. And then we have this scenario where we can manage the surplus a little bit differently than we can manage the fully funded status. So what happens if we run into problems? So look at the bottom arrow points down there. These are two obvious solutions. We can increase contributions, which goes back to the shareholders, and then we can decrease benefits. That's never a popular answer. If you look if you read the Wall Street Journal, you'll read about this regularly. Of course, the currently retired employees, they're under contract, so you can't really decrease their benefits. But what you can say to the employees who are working, you can say, oh, you know what? We promised you this particular formula, but we need to adjust this formula. And so essentially your benefits are going to decrease, comma, or in parentheses, therefore, why don't you just work another 1 or 2 or 3 years, and then you'll be where you were in the old days. All right, planned beneficiaries. So we've said this, right? Active members and the retired members. So here's a good block point. The higher proportion of retired members, we've got shorter investment horizon. So there's that link between long-term, what I said, most of these have long-term investment horizons, but you got to be careful with some of the institutions like the pension. So remember that we've got tons and tons of retired workers out there, and we have a shorter investment horizon, and then probably lower risk tolerance there. Defined contribution plans, which is what most college professors, I'm guessing all college professors have. I make these contributions. My school makes these contributions. And so the future value of my retirement plan depends on how much I contribute, how much my college contributes, and then what we do with it. If we just put it in there in a money market fund, I get 1% or 2%, or I put it in all sorts of crazy equity securities, then I'm taking all the risk. And that's pretty much the big difference here. The liabilities of the sponsor are equivalent to their mandatory contributions. That makes sense there. Yeah, we need to worry about the age and the investment balances. And so this is probably important. We need to make certain as the plan sponsor that we make sure that we give our employees lots and lots of choices. I think we have 3 choices at my college. We have some life cycle asset allocations. We have target date. Personally, I don't do any of those things. I just go in and I'll change my allocations based on whatever I've been reading in the Wall Street Journal and whatever the CFA Institute tells me as I'm reading all their fantastic materials. Here are some additional stakeholder interests that might show up on the exam. All right, so the plan sponsors, they contribute, they oversee, board of directors do the same thing, inform participants. Plan beneficiaries. So here, this is what I was saying earlier, bear the investment risk and longevity risk. If I were to pass away before I'm done working, well, then I think just my wife is my beneficiary. I don't think my children are on my pension fund. Don't tell them I said that. And then, of course, governments provide all sorts of tax incentives. Here's another good time to get out your phone, take a picture of the difference between those two types of plans. So what the Institute will do is they'll say, hey, this is a defined benefit plan, or this is a defined contribution plan. And then you should know all this stuff here. And this is kind of a summary of what we've been talking about. Go ahead and take another picture here. This is a little bit of a summary, but there's some extra details in here about liquidity that you probably should go over. So go ahead and take a picture of this. But these are obvious notions. All right, how about moving on to sovereign wealth funds? So think about Live Golf and the PGA Tour. Here are some different types. Budget stabilization funds. So what does that sound an awful lot like? That sounds an awful lot like here's this fund, and what we want to do is we want to put some capital in here, and we want to preserve that capital, and we want to generate a return above inflation. What this does then is that it detaches cyclical assets from being linked to the government's ability to either generate more revenue through a different kind of a tax policy. And so this budget stabilization, as you can imagine, will probably have pretty low risk and low volatility investments. Development funds, so this is a little bit different here. Development, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and not worry about inflation explicitly, but worry about productivity. And so this, of course, is going to be measured by GDP. And what this is going to do is this is going to contribute to the country's economic competitiveness. This is where countries, as they're growing, will say something like, hey, it's the government's responsibility to invest in technology. So this development fund will take some of its investments and it'll go and say, okay, here's Jim's technology company over there. Here, Jim, here's a bunch of money. Go ahead and do some research. And then when you invest and then you have a positive return and you develop some new kind of technology, then we're all better off, right? Not just you and not just the government, but all of society is better off. Savings funds, this is exactly like what you got when you were little. And if you had grandparents who loved you like I did. Now, my father's parents died when I was young, but my mom's parents, boy, they would give me $5 for my birthday. And I would look at that, this is 1965 or 68, I'm looking at this $5 bill. And for me, it could have been $100. I was so amazed that my grandparents loved me for this. So what did I do with it? Well, when I got to be like 10 or 12, I started buying rock and roll records. This is what I was. So I didn't ensure intergenerational wealth transfer. I wish I had all those records right now. Boy, wouldn't it be awesome if I had that 45 from one of those great humble pie or traffic 45 records that came out a long time ago. All right, so intergenerational wealth transfer. If I would have invested in those things and then put them in my attic and not worried about it, then my children and my grandchildren, then they could sell that, Peter Frampton from humble pie. Maybe that's worth $1 million right now. Yeah, so there we go. Maintain purchasing power, sustain governmental activities. We can also have reserve funds. All right, so we're going to try to invest in funds that are tied to foreign trade, right? So when we go over there and buy something, we need that particular currency. And so it makes sense for us to hold a bunch of that currency somewhere, right? So we call these foreign exchange reserves. So we have this reserve fund that helps support what we're doing in the international trade. So look at this, look at that bottom part there, that bottom finger point, international purchasing power. And then pensions, this is exactly what we've been talking about here, so that we can make sure that we have enough to pay all of our elderly when they decide to retire. I'll go ahead and comment and say, here in the United States, we have Social Security, and there are lots of people who are worried about those long-term viability and those long-term benefits. All right, stakeholders, the citizens, the government, the board, the managers, and external asset managers. That makes perfect sense there. Yeah, liabilities and investment horizon. All right, so these sovereign wealth funds, they vary in all of their different kinds of objectives, depending on which of those 5 that we just described in those previous slides. They might have different goals, they might have different objectives, they might have different time horizons and different liquidity needs. And so here we go. Here's a couple of diamond points that illustrate some of those differences. Now, budget stabilization funds, there's lots and lots of liquidity in there, so low risk and highly liquid assets. Development funds, the liquidity depends on their mission. So you'll probably have a sentence or two inside of the question stem that would lead you to suggest, hey, you know what, this is low liquidity, this is moderate liquidity, or this is high liquidity. But lots of these have low liquidity. So tend to the low liquidity side unless there's something to indicate that there are high liquidity needs. And one of those indications is that last block point there, due to long-term investment horizon. So if there's something that says in the question stem, hey, here's a development fund, but we have some liquidity issues, well, then that must mean that we have a shorter time horizon. Savings funds has low liquidity, reserves funds probably moderate, and then the pension, those probably shift over time. Although there are people, according to the demographics of just kind of world population, wherever you go, there are a bunch of people who are 65 years old. All right, how about we move on to endowments? So look at the 3 beautiful illustrations. We have universities, churches, hospitals, and there are others out there, but these are probably the main ones. Funded through donations to support key services. And those donations, they can be just actually going out and saying to someone, hey, you know what, can you donate some money to us? Or they can be events. I play in a handful of golf tournaments throughout the year that are used to support things like universities and churches and hospitals. And so they take a part, I might pay $200 to play a round of golf, and they might take 50 of that, and that goes to the golf course, and they take 150, maybe another 50 of it goes to all the expenses, and then they have 100. So those donations don't have to be exactly direct donations. They can be indirect donations. Yeah, so what do these endowments do? They invest in capital markets, long-term service provision, intergenerational equity. We talked about that. So the board or the trustees, they preserve equity among generations. This is what I was saying to you earlier, that the administration at my college, they always say, oh yeah, we're making a lot of money in the stock market. However, what if we lose a lot of money in the stock market? Stakeholders, I said this before, current and future students. Alumni, this has everything to do with the branding of the college. I mean, clearly Harvard is super proud of their endowment. They're the largest university endowment, and they tell everybody about it, and well, they should. It's a tremendous success story. And success stories in the investment world ought to be admired. And they not ought to be frowned upon, and clearly they should not be taxed. There's my little editorial for the day, unless there's some taxable implications out there, and of course there are some, but that's not the conversation we're having here today. Current and future faculty and administrators, the larger university community donors, the board, financial services. So think about all those stakeholders here. Think about all that as tied to the branding and the brand name of that particular university. Now, the liabilities, this is determined by, pretty much the president of the college in conjunction with the board of trustees. And what they'll say is something like, we would like to take 5% of the fund and put that into our annual operating budget. 5%. Could be 4%. I think the reading might even suggest, 2% to 7% or something like that. This is really interesting, from my personal standpoint, because I see this on at least a monthly basis at my school, where there's a battle going on between, how much should we take out of that endowment and put it into the annual budget. And of course, the idea is that, boy, it'd be great if the college were completely self-funded. But most colleges need to rely on that endowment fund. So the endowment fund has to grow like this, and then that 5% has to grow like this, right? So, so you can continue to grow and maintain the brand name. So if you get to a question about a university or even a church or a hospital, think about the brand name, and that ought to be able to answer that question. Yeah, key liability considerations, universities' fundraising capacity, that makes sense. Ability to issue debt. What you guys may know and you may not know is that colleges and universities have the ability, I'm not sure if that's the right word, they have the capacity or they have the timeliness to issue bonds in conjunction with local municipalities. So it doesn't have to be just a private institution bond issue. It can be some type of municipal bond issue. And so that, of course, then depends on the strength of the tax base inside of that municipality. Here are some quick boxes down at the bottom that it suggests and illustrates what I was saying earlier. So you can have a constant growth rule. There's the 4% or 6% or 5%, whatever that is. Or you can say, you know what, whatever we increase in value, we'll do that market value rule. The market value, that's cyclical. We don't do that at my college. And I don't know that others do that very regularly, but I'm sure some of them do. And of course, you can have a hybrid. There's a spending rule formula there. The LOS asks you to discuss. I'd be super shocked if the Institute asked you to calculate the spending amount in year T+1, which would be the current operating budget year. So all we're doing is inside of that formula, we're going to take the spending amount from last year or the current year, multiply that by 1 plus the inflation rate, and then to take that spending rate. So no, it's a weighted average here. So notice the W and then the 1 minus W. So that's just a weighted average there. So spending rule formula questions that may pop up on the exam. Just remember that the spending amount is a function of what you picked. Is it the constant growth? Is it the market value? Is it a hybrid? So that's the W inside of there. And then how much you spent last year, what you think inflation rate is, and then what's the size of the assets under management. You can have a target rate, endowment's annual net spending rate 2 to 4%. I do know that our endowment has a separate fund for scholarships. So we'll go ahead and take some of that for scholarships if we can't raise that money for scholarships during the course of the year. Liquidity needs, high short-term volatility because we take in the long term. Of course, most of these universities have tons and tons of equities or hedge funds or private investments, and then some proportion of fixed income securities. Private foundations, these are nonprofit. So typically what they do is they support, the local or the national or the international community. And so think about my example earlier when I said, hey, you know what, I hit the Powerball. I have a couple $100 million. I start a foundation. So what could I do? As the founding donor, I could say, you know what, I want this to go to rental assistance for individuals who have recently lost their jobs due to disability or family issues or and I can make a list there. And so what does the investment committee do? They invest in stocks and bonds and they pay dividends, right? And they make coupon payments. And so, those cash flows then go for rental assistance. Or I could say, you know what? I noticed in my local community, that we've got, let's say 100 high school students who graduate and they want to go to art schools or they want to go to a music school, and there's very little scholarships available for those. So I could say, look, I want you to grant 20 scholarships a year for full tuition. So you take the tuition. What's tuition in an art school? 40,000 times whatever the number is. So you work through that, or other charitable activities. And there are some examples down there. Community foundations, that's probably what mine was. Operating foundations, that could be what I'm doing as well. But they probably help local communities in terms of the business. They might say I might say, you know what, I want you to take some of this money, and I'll use my technology example that I had earlier for the sovereign wealth funds. I'll say, you know what, I want you to make loans, low interest rate loans, to anybody out there who has a new idea for technology, for whatever it is. Corporate foundations, if you read the Wall Street Journal regularly, you'll read about these. Private grant-making foundations. Main objectives, purchasing power. There's a trend toward limited life foundation because what tends to happen is that donors who are super altruistic, right? And they say, I want to help, but then over time, they want to get back into it. So they might say, you know what, you guys can have my money for 10 years and then I'm taking over again. Yeah, health, education. So those were the examples that I gave you. Some foundations make large and targeted grants to specific causes. All right, that makes sense, yeah. Stakeholders then, the founders, the family, the grant recipients, of course, broader community, government, board members. I mean, just, these foundations, they pretty much help everybody out there. Yeah, investment horizon, these things go on forever and ever. Although, what did I just say a moment ago? Some have finite lives or, relatively short lifetimes. So we want to protect the principal. Donations, smoothing formula, right? We don't want to go way up and way down. Smaller investment officers, that makes sense. There's some small things here. These could show up on the exam. Liquidity needs, low liquidity. Maybe higher than university endowments. Of course, the university endowments, that depends on what those operating budgets mean and need. Significant allocations to illiquid asset classes like hedge funds and private equity and real estate. We can use derivatives. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Go ahead and get your phone out. Take a picture of this, university endowments versus private foundations. There's lots and lots of commonalities in here, but there are some differences, so I would just go through and know those differences. All right, our last one here, banks and insurance companies. So what do? We accept deposits and make loans. What are we trying to do? Safeguard assets, execute transactions in securities and cash. So this has everything to do with the right-hand side of the balance sheet and the left-hand side of the balance sheet that I've mentioned many times in this recording. What they can do is they are writers of options and they participate at least partially in the futures market. And then, of course, they're huge counterparties in the swap market. Go back to the 2008 financial crisis, and there are a bunch of these financial institutions that lost tons of money because of they were thinking that those premiums paid to them on credit default swaps, of course we can't call them premiums because it sounds like insurance, that those were free money, and in fact they turned out to be not free. All right, how about insurers? So they sell policies, they collect premiums, and then they pay claims when they're due. So you got the life insurance companies and you have property and casualty companies. So, think about this. Both sides, life insurance and P&C, they're collecting premiums, right? Every day they get premiums in there. And so what are they doing? They're taking that and they're paying their operating expenses, right? Of course. And then what's left over, they go and invest it. Well, what would be ideal for an insurance company would be to know exactly when those of us, right, you and me, we're participating in this market, when we're going to crash our car, when our house is going to catch on fire, and when we're going to get sick and when we're going to die, those things. Now they know when a pool of us, is going to do this on average, but they don't know which individual of us is going to do this. So this offers a tremendous challenge. And that's why we said in one of those very first slides about the LDI model, which is really almost the same thing as we talked about here. It's the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the balance sheet. All right, so here we have differences and commonalities in stakeholders. So all you really need to do is memorize those last three down on the bottom. They don't show up for insurance companies, so you ought to be able to answer that question. All right, bank liabilities, deposits, more than half of total. So think of deposits. All we need to do is to whip out our debit card and go buy something, and there we go. The bank has to take money out of our account. So those deposits, they don't even, I don't even think it's fair to say it's short term, but it's instantaneous liability. What's the duration of a deposit? Now, of course, banks are super smart, and you guys know this better than I do, is that you know exactly what percent of those total deposits are going to flow out today, how much are going to flow out tomorrow, and then next week and next month. And so that liability management is keyed on being able to know exactly what that chronology of those deposit outflow is. Then you can have short-term funding, just how about if I just use the simple example of a 1-year certificate of deposit or a 6-month certificate of deposit, and then long-term debt, of course. Types of deposits, I don't even know if this is true anymore. Time deposits, interest-bearing accounts, right? Demand deposits, they like checking, I don't know, can't even remember the last time my wife and I wrote a check. We have a checking account, but our children, none of our children have checking accounts. They have a debit card and they use it like a credit card, right? And then they Venmo or they do, I don't even know what all those other things are. I let my wife take care of that stuff. However, I'm guessing that you younger people ought to know the difference between time deposits and demand deposits. Bank investments, operate indefinitely. Although what do we know about banks? They don't have an indefinite time period. They need to make decisions as if they were operating ongoing concerns. But lots of banks get taken over. Lots of banks go bankrupt. Lots of banks are taken over by the government. So I'm not quite sure how that fits in to the stakeholder part of this LOS. The insurance companies, there's the focus on asset liability management. Of course, this is super important. Go ahead and take a picture of this one here. Life insurance versus P&C. Life insurance have long durations. P&C have shorter durations. This is simply because I'm probably going to live longer during a time period, and I'll be able to watch my car get crashed into, watch my basement get flooded, et cetera, et cetera. So look at the second block point. Remember, a great exam question would be predictability, higher potential volatility, 20 to 40 years. I wouldn't be married to that, but just really a long time period. Investment nature and horizon influenced by expected policy claims. So the claims for life are very different than claims for liability or home. Time horizon is perpetual. That makes sense. Go ahead and take a picture of the difference between liquidity needs. Look down on the bottom right there. We have a reserve portfolio for insurers and we have a surplus portfolio. So this is super important. And that takes us through the LOSs for part one. What I want you to do now is I want you to just turn this off and go do something else. What I'm going to ask you to do after you watch part two, I'm going to have you go to the end of this reading and look and work through, I think there are 18 questions there, 3 or 4 different vignettes, and we've covered all that stuff. And so it's about half of what those questions are. So just pause for now, watch that second slide deck here, in an hour or so or a day or so, whenever you feel like you have some time to do this. So, hey, thanks for watching. Have a great day and good luck studying.